Let me welcome you to the training. Sheli Reynolds, who is the Associate Director of the Institute of Human Development and is the founder, developer, and creator of Charting the Life Course. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Charting the Life Course is probably the most prevalent person-centered planning model that's used in the most number of states across the country. And there's a big promotion of states adopting that. This is one of many models, as we talked about with you, from PATH to essential life plans to several of them. And what we're trying to do is bring forth to Nebraska examples of this. So we're very honored and pleased that we have Sheli spend her time and be with us today, be sharing, explaining what Charting the Life Course is and what it has to offer. With that, I'm going to turn you over to Sheli. And Sheli, you're on. Thank you so much for being with us and giving us your time as a stellar presenter and academic that you are. Thank you, Sheli.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate you spending an hour with us this afternoon. So just to add on a little bit to what Mark said, my name is Sheli Reynolds. I work at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, which is our statewide university center on excellence in developmental disabilities. And so I'm really pleased to be here. Not only, I've been working at the Institute now for 23 years and have had a number of different roles, really that all have built on one another. As a student, I started out really supporting the self-advocacy movement and spent 12 years of my career really supporting our statewide self-advocates to organize their organization and to advocate at the state and the federal level. And then evolved into really moving into supporting our statewide family-to-family health information center in providing parent-to-parent and peer support and leadership development. Over the last 12 years, I've really kind of taken both of those things and really looked at it from a policy and a practice, and how are we implementing it at a state, national, and policy level. And so a lot of that work has happened because of the National Community of Practice on Supports to Families, which is a partnership we have with the National Association for State Directors for Developmental Disability Services. But as you also can see from the slide is most of this passion is really driven from the fact that I'm a family member. I have a brother in his 30s with a developmental disabilities. And so, growing up as a sibling and being, his sister, his friend, his advocate, sometimes they're planners. Sometimes I always say you're behavioral specialist when it comes to supporting Eric and really supporting one another, all the things that he's also done for me throughout my life as well. So most of the life course framework has come from lived experiences, both as a sibling, supporting Eric, but also, and really trying to understand my parents' needs as Eric continues to navigate systems throughout his entire lifespan, but also, as my parents start aging and looking into the future. So I'll share some of that with you as well. Before I get started, though, I want to introduce you to my friend Ben. I'm introducing him to you because Ben has allowed me to share his examples of integrating and utilizing Charting the Life Course to really kind of bring home some of the different components that I'm going to talk about. As you can see there's a one-pager, and I partly do this because I want people to realize that sometimes I tell people the planning tools themselves can be utilized for lots of different reasons. Ben is an amazing individual, and as you can just even tell from his picture of Mr. T up on the top, he has quite a personality, and it's really important for people to recognize that although Ben has support needs, he's very involved in his community, and you'll really hear that throughout this presentation. So Ben has co-presented with me at other times, but this time we have his approval to share information about him. So what are our objectives today in our short amount of time? I will tell you, I'm going to give you a really quick scratch the surface synopsis of charting the life course. But there's many different ways that we can dig into lots of different topics in the future. But I'm going to introduce the framework. I'm going to share with you that not only can we use it working with individuals and or their families, we can also use this exact same framework and most of the tools actually at a policy level. So working on organizational change, working on team development, working on quality assurance. We have examples from all over the country where people have taken the key principles and have applied it to policy and practices. I'm hoping to share with you some concrete examples that you can take away and start utilizing right away. All of these tools are on our website. We develop everything so that you can use it, and constantly trying to make sure that they're user friendly and that they adapt and that you can utilize them in whatever setting that you want. So be sure to check out the website when I'm done with this. But before I get started, I want to set the stage with you and kind of I always tell people I'm a visual thinker. I think in terms of colors and images when I am having conversations, and a lot of the stuff that you are going to see on the PowerPoints are really the sort of visual interpretations of concepts that we really have had in our field for a long time. I tell people I could do it almost I could probably do an hour or a full day just with the slide alone. And what the slide really does for me is it helps you really to articulate where we're headed overall with the life course framework. And so, I always tell people you don't often think about these different circles in your life, but just think about yourself, for example. And over on the left hand side of that slide where it says person, put your name. So I'd put Sheli there. And I would think about my family in the purple, and some of it's my immediate family, and some of it's my extended family. Some family lives in my house. Some family, lives in St. Louis. Other family are actually friends that have become like family. So I start thinking about all those people that exist in my life when I think about family and friends. And then I think about community, and community can mean lots of things, right? So community could be the actual physical environment that I live in, my street, my subdivision, where I go to school, where I go and get my favorite coffee. So community could be structure. But community could also be the other places. So I'm a community member on the as a parent of my son's basketball team. You might be a community member of your faith-based organization, or so community is a lot of things. So when we start thinking about disability services, or really a lot of social services, not just disability, we really start thinking about the circles in the middle. And if you look at the history of our fields and the social services, we take that person who has support needs, whatever they might be. Maybe it's brain injury, maybe it's a developmental disability, maybe it's a physical disability, a behavioral health, or maybe a person's aging. And we've traditionally thought about how do we wrap that person in services? How do we really support them? And we've gotten more sophisticated over the last 100 years, where we started to really hone in on some promising practices and some best practices. And we even talk about identifying exactly what that person needs are and then connecting them to those. But if you look at that visual in the middle of that slide, because those services are completely wrapped around a person with the best intentions, what is it doing to our relationships with our family and friends? What is it doing to our relationships in the community and our membership and roles in the community? And in some ways, those services themselves are actually the barriers to the inclusion and the integration and the quality of life that we're looking for. Now, I'm a person whose brother requires 24-hour supports. So when I first started hearing this and saying this and sharing this, I would say, but that doesn't mean that services are wrong or that they're bad or that we don't need them. What we're saying is how are we delivering those systems in a way that supports the person, who they are, their strengths, their abilities, their interests, supports the relationships, builds on their community membership. So it actually requires us as professionals, whether we're planning or developing policies, to rethink that green circle and to rethink about how it can be delivered differently. And so what you see over there is what we call the integrated services and support star. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But what it talks about is how are we identifying and integrating services and supports? Some paid, some relationship based, some community based, some technology, and really delving in and really building the strengths of that individual. And sometimes the supports are needed for the family. Sometimes the supports are needed in the community. And sometimes the supports are needed for that individual. And so this visual on the right-hand side is ultimately our goal with the LifeCourse framework of how do we really support people in the community to have the relationships they want with the supports that they need. I already mentioned that a lot of this came from the National Community of Practice, but here on this map starts showing you some of the states DD agencies who have committed to really thinking about this as a systemic statewide policy change and cultural change. So it was not only the fact that we had these states and we had this framework. We used the framework to shape the conversations in the states, but those states themselves are also shaping the framework. We really learn together and really refine both the framework and also identify policies and practices that can continue to change. So when we set out on this journey in the national community practice, we were really looking at what type of change do we want? And I don't know if you've ever read the book Creating Blue Space by Hans Mesner, but I love when they start talking about the type of change that's needed. And I think it's perfect, especially when you're thinking about person-centered planning or you're thinking about sort of disability or social service change. We spend a lot of time in transitional change, and transitional change is very important. That those things that are listed underneath there, new services, processes, systems, mergers, consolidations, all of those things are really important. But if you're really going to transform services so people have the lives that they want and lead to the good life and quality of life that they're driving, we have to make transformational change. And that requires us to really challenge our sort of principles, our culture, our thinking, our beliefs, and sort of disrupt those structures. I always use the analogy when I go into a state. When I think of transitional change and I'm trying to describe what that type of change is, I always say to people, think about case managers, and I'll just pick on Missouri because that's where I'm from. They were called case managers 10 years ago, and then we changed their names to service coordinators, and then we decided they weren't service coordinators, they were support coordinators. So we're constantly changing the titles of these different positions that plan with people. And so that's a transitional change. But what are we fundamentally trying to change when we change those titles? Are we changing their behaviors? Are we changing their beliefs? Are we merely just giving them a new title? And so transformational change really requires us to have some guiding principles. And that was really where the LifeCourse framework started. The LifeCourse framework, what I love about the LifeCourse framework is I tell people it can either be an umbrella for organizing all of the wonderful things in our field, or it can even fill in the gaps. So it's not meant to ever replace anything that you're already doing, but rather build upon that. So, whether it as actual tools or whether it's practices themselves or whether it's theories that you've learned, how do all of those work together? How do they hang together? Because you can't just take any one of those theories and think about it in isolation. Because when you start working with a person or their family, they need all of those things put together. They need you to take those all in and integrate all of those great practices and decide the best way you're going to interact with somebody. So, what is Trying the Life Course? Trying the Life Course was created really. We brought together individuals with disabilities and their families over a course of the year, and we just kept asking the question, what do you wish you knew but you didn't know? And I always tell people, how does somebody know? Yes, there's lots of directories out there to give me phone numbers, but how do I really know about expectations and possibilities? And so we sat down and we started to really think about all these different questions that were really about the life experiences. And we started to really organize them by life stages and life domains and just use that as a way for us to start building other things. So fast forward 12 years later to where we are today, they really, LifeCourse tools at their heart and soul are really designed for individuals and their families to use by themselves. And they're designed to give a person and their family ways to educate themselves and problem solve. But what's exciting is over the years, they've been adapted and implemented within practices for person-centered planning or for problem solving. But at the heart and soul, no matter what you're using them for, they help you explore possibilities, talk about ideas, hopes, and fears, set higher expectations. What are those expectations around a personal goals, or whether those are expectations around federal policy? They help you sort navigate the future, advocate for your vision, and problem solve and plan. Trying the life course has kind of become this larger system. It's become this framework for driving transformational change. And not in addition to the framework and the principles are icons that help people articulate or advocate for what they want, or to really talk to one another. Because what we found way at the beginning is all life course materials are developed, and the words that we use are the way that anybody talks. And I often find, when you start planning with a family and social services, they start speaking disability speak or social service speak. And so we talk about really creating a language for when you're talking to your next door neighbor. How can we develop processes and tools and resources that use common language, both the icons themselves and the words that are used? The Charting the Life course is supported across the nation and really across the country, and you creating a network for us to learn and share together. We don't have all the answers, we don't have all the tools, but we're constantly learning from you as we go and developing those things. So let's jump right into that. So at the core is our core belief that all people and their families have the right to live, love, learn, work, play, and pursue their life aspirations and their community. I think it's really important that I start with that core belief, because what you see on there, it does not say all people with disabilities or all people that need supports. It rather says all people. And very intentionally, when we first started working on this framework, it was very specific to people with developmental disabilities. And we knew if we created a core belief and a framework that was specific to people with developmental disabilities, what we were doing was creating a different standard of core beliefs. We have to believe that everybody has the right to live, love, learn, and work and play in their community. And from that, the frameworks evolved. The other key word on our core belief is the word rights. I always tell everybody, when you're listening to me talk, do you realize you are actually part of a civil rights movement? So when you support somebody to plan, you are supporting somebody to access and really leverage their civil rights. And so really, when we start thinking about planning and problem solving from that framework, we start really seeing our role as a professional very differently than planning only for employment or planning for education or planning for long-term services. So I'm going to jump right into the first principle. Our first key principle is focusing on all people. And the reason we focused on this key principle was because we started to recognize, if we're going to create a framework, it needs to encompass all people with whatever target population you're looking at, whether it's aging, traumatic brain injury, developmental disabilities. Because what we find is that most state and national programs don't serve the all, but we needed a framework and tools that would anybody could access, whether they were getting services or not. This became crucial to developing the planning process and the planning tools, because we need to be able to plan with a person that's outside of the service system, and need to be able to utilize those tools for people inside the service system. What we know from the slide right here is that we know the prevalence rate of people with developmental disabilities, and it's about 5 million people in our country. And we also know the data for the number that are served by state DD agencies. And what you can see from that, only 25% of the 4.7 million people actually receive paid services from their state DD agency. This tells me as a professional that our planning has to go beyond our state DD agencies. We have to be planning and problem solving with the other 75%. So we utilize that concept of all to really keep us grounded in our practices and our policies, to not forget the all and not just to focus on those that are currently in front of us in our service systems. The other principle, and it's really a really big principle when we dig in and have more time, is the person within the context of their family. But I'm going to highlight it a little bit here. When we're thinking about the person, are we thinking about their individual biological likes, dislikes, skills, abilities, and needs? Are we thinking about their social needs, their sort of where they're living and where they're growing up, and some of their own expectations? But we can't ignore the fact that most of us are influenced by our family. So when we're planning with a person, are we aware of those things? Do we know how they influence or impact them? I remember working with this individual who lived on a farm, and the family was convinced that that was where this adult child should stay and continue their career. And that person couldn't wait to get out of that environment. So one, we needed to understand where they grew up, and we need to understand if they want to continue in those environments. But I always tell people, if you look at the green one over there, expectations and aspirations, do we truly understand how that person was raised? Were they raised with the idea that they expected to be employed when they were older? Can we influence expectations for younger families so they can set that sort of behavior and sort of that trajectory towards employment or living on your own or living with utilizing technology supports? So we cannot ignore the person and the context of their family. I bring this up because I cannot tell you how many people have come up to me and say, well, we provide person-centered supports. Why do you keep mentioning the family? Well, because we're influenced by our family, not only in terms of all of the context of who we are, but also because they are an important part of our life. And so how are we leveraging those relationships, leveraging the knowledge that the family and friends can offer when we go through our planning process? I also think it's really important for people to point out also why we talk about family so much. When we're talking about services for people with developmental disabilities, it's important to know who's getting services and where they're getting those services. I think there's this large misnomer that all of a sudden, as someone turns 18 and their family doesn't have some sort of connection to their day-to-day supports. The data tells us otherwise. If we look at the 4.7 million people with developmental disabilities, we know 25% of them are receiving services. But the most important statistic there is, where are they receiving those services? More people are receiving services in their own home or their family home than they are inside of a provider organization. That is a very, very significant information, because if we're really going to talk about providing person-centered supports, but the individual lives in their own home, how are we wrestling with that sort of, the autonomy of the individual, but recognizing that the environment is the family's home? And so it requires us to really understand how services are being delivered and understand how we can really use the planning process to both help think through the family unit needs as well as the individual needs, and then how those needs work together. Our third principle is really looking at the trajectory of life experiences. And this has a whole, a number of components within in this as well. But I always tell people I really love this quote. And I think that some of your other speakers talked about a vision and a dream. But, the future is not something we enter. It's something we create, which requires us to make choices and decisions that begin with a dream. And when I sit down and I'm starting to actually do training with service coordinators or families around person-centered planning, I always say to them, just in your most common language, define for me what your good life looks like. What does that look like? What is your vision? Maybe you live your good life right now, or maybe you're trying to achieve this good life. But what is that good life? And that's where I start all conversations. It's actually where I started in terms of working on federal policy. What does our vision for federal policy look like? But at the person level, I really have the individual describe what that vision is, or their family. What is the vision for a good life? And then I tell people that is person-centered right there. Everything that we do, the person-centered planning process, the forms, the services that we identify, the supports that we engage with should all be supporting your vision. But not only is it important for you to know what your good life is, it's also important for you to define what is not a good life for you. And I will tell you that I have better conversations actually talking about what I don't want than what I do want. So I'll utilize Ben here for a second. His parents could very well articulate to me exactly what they didn't want in Ben's life. They had a much harder time articulating what they saw for the vision for the future because they didn't really understand what was possible for someone like Ben that requires 24-hour support needs, but they still knew they wanted him to live independently in his community, but they didn't know what it looked like. So they could say to me, I know that we don't want him working in a sheltered workshop. I know I do not want him living in a group home, and define those for me. And what they could do throughout that planning process as we got to know them and spend time together over the years was it helped them to further define their vision up at the top. Now, I will tell you, the individual themselves, it's not hard for them to tell you what their vision is. They're very clear in what they want most of the times if we can communicate that with them. And so that trajectory towards, I always tell everybody that vision is your North Star for every conversation, whether it's during the planning process or whether it's during your monthly, quality assurance reviews. But the other thing this slide is starting to introduce to you is this concept of a trajectory. And what I tell people is everybody is on a trajectory. Your life is a trajectory, right? And things and decisions that you make every single day are either going to lead you to your vision or they're going to lead you to what you don't want. And you are going through life experiences and different decisions that move you there. When we start thinking about services and supports, what I tell everybody as services and supports is that solid blue line that's pointing up at that black line. The job of services and supports is not to create a different life trajectory for you, but to rather support you on your life trajectory. And so, I think when I'm training direct support professionals, I say to them, you're that blue arrow. So you should be identifying what Ben wants and what he doesn't want. You should understand his life experiences and the things that are going on day to day. And you should say to yourself, how do I enhance his trajectory to get him to where he wants to go? Sometimes in our field, services themselves become the trajectory. Somebody wants a service and it becomes a trajectory line as opposed to that person wants life experiences with supports that support that person. So, what do I really mean by that? When we start thinking about the life trajectory across life stages, we have all these different transition points, right? And when we start talking disability, people often start talking to us about service system transitions, like, oh, you're graduating from school, at 14, did you have your transition planning meeting? Have you signed up for services? And so there's all these different federal and state and local policies about how to access the really important services that are offered. And oftentimes, what we find though is who's having the conversation about the life experiences that you should be having? Who's talking to you about learning to say no, talking about chores. I do a lot in the employment space, and I always say to voc rehab counselors or families or service coordinators that are trying to increase employment outcomes. I say, well, how do you expect someone to become employed if, for 21 years of their life, no one actually gave them a chore to do, or nobody helped them understand that their behavior and their social skills actually are going to lead to employment or get them fired? So it's the life experiences that become so important. And for me, that's what the Life Course, we have different resources and tools that help you dig into life experiences for anybody at that life stage. And how are we helping a person to engage in those life experiences? We can't teach somebody to be safe from abuse if they don't know how to say no, if they don't understand the consequences of that, if they haven't had a chance to say no under natural circumstances. And that becomes even harder if you're a person that's always had staff around you. You know, they've become that sort of, protector to you of really having, heartaches and, coming home late and breaking rules and really figuring out some natural consequences. So the life experience conversation in the planning process to me is more important sometimes as a starting point than starting with the service conversations, but rather what should be going on for this life stage? What are the life experiences that we're really trying to either work on or we're trying to do to help achieve those outcomes? And then what services support those? I always tell people this is circular sort of thing, right? If I have a vision that helps set my expectations, if I have expectations as an individual, or let's say as a mom, then that means I'm going to give my child more experiences that are aligned with those expectations. And the more experiences and life experiences I have, the more opportunities open up and the more possibilities that I understand are available. Excuse me. Which ultimately changed my vision. Your vision is constantly evolving. We wonder why people's visions don't change. Well, really challenge yourself. Did they have any different experiences that opened their eyes to different possibilities? Because if their vision isn't evolving, that's what we really need to be paying attention to in our planning process. So here's what this looks like on a worksheet. So taking all of those sort of framework and principle concepts of principle and life experiences, here's Ben's life course trajectory. So we always start the planning process on the right-hand side. So even though the sheet, you would think you read it left to right, you don't. You actually start the process with, help me, Ben, understand what's your vision for a good life. Help me understand what you don't want. And this one-page document just it gives you a really, really quick, way to articulate that, capture it, and even advocate and share it with your team members and have it quickly available to you. We then jump over to the left-hand side of the life course trajectory and we say to ourselves, okay, are we going to use your whole lifespan or are we going to just use this last 6 months to a year? Ben wanted to think about his entire past life experience and said, what really shaped you? And he said, well, these are all the things that I really like to do and things that I think are helping me move towards my trajectory towards a good life. And below that line are the things that actually I think take me in the wrong direction. Um, some of the expectations in special education were very low. Some of my physical and medical disabilities were huge barriers. A lot of medication. Having a paraprofessional around him his entire educational career prevented from building friendships and him learning to be more independent. So we recognize that this is a starting point for Ben. Oftentimes, when I'm planning with an individual, they don't have a life that rich. They might not have all of these life experiences. And so sometimes we need to spend more time actually engaging in life experiences so they really know what goal or outcomes they really want. So then you look in that middle column. That middle column goes where the sort of person-centered formal planning process can really kind of start leveraging. So Ben, if we know where you're heading and we know where you've been and what we can build on and what we need to avoid, what is it we need to do right now that we either need to sustain or work on? And so for Ben, he wants to continue volunteering at the fire station. He knows he needs to work out regularly. He wants to keep in touch with his friends. He wants to explore micro enterprise as an option for employment. But we also know, Ben, what's going to actually take you the wrong way right now? And he was like sitting around every day, gaining weight, eating a bunch of unhealthy food because Pepsi's my most favorite thing. And so this both helped him articulate what he wanted, but we've used this exact trajectory now to go create his formal outcomes and his service plan. We also use this trajectory when Ben is training his staff and wanting his staff to understand what he wants to do. So there's lots of different ways to incorporate that concept. This next one is just to show you that the trajectory worksheet can be used for anything. So when COVID hit back in March and April, Ben and his mom sat down and used the trajectory to think about how to help Ben respond to the COVID crisis. And so you see on the right-hand side what we want for Ben during COVID. We want him to stay busy, keep working on his fitness, connected to people. But we needed mom and dad to stay healthy because he lives at home with mom and dad. So we were very clear there. He was clear, his parents were clear, and this helped them articulate this to their services and supports. They knew what they didn't want. They knew what they didn't, you move away from sadness and stress and all of those sorts of things. And then you see over on the left-hand side are some of the things that they knew they could put into place immediately to respond to COVID. So this gave both their family and their services and their support staff ideas of ways to keep him engaged towards his vision. But it also showed you what were potential obstacles and barriers. So the concept of trajectory and vision can be utilized and problem solved no matter what problem or issue you're working on. The other thing about the life course framework is this concept around a holistic focus. And so there's some times where we really, really need to focus and hone in on a specific domain. So maybe daily life, employment, safety, and security. But there's other times we need to recognize all of those are connected. I can't talk to an individual about employment if I don't understand how they can get there, what types of supports they need. I can't talk to you about where you want to live if I don't know how much money you make. And so your employment impacts that. So the life domains have become what I call our Dewey Decimal System. It becomes a way for us to organize our planning to understand how they're all connected together, but also to hone in specifically. So we take all the exact same tools that might be holistic and we actually color code them based on these colors. So when you pick it up, you know you're digging into a specific life domain area. So here's an example. It's not necessarily meant for you to read because it's very, very small print, but more of an example of Ben's mom sat down. You see this says family perspective tool, does not say a person-centered tool. Mom wanted to articulate her perspective around Ben's vision and life domains and goals for the future and for now. Very different than Ben's. And so this valued her voice in the planning process, but also really showed it's the family perspective. This mom loves detail and she filled out the entire thing. And you see on the right-hand side, though, it says medium, high, low, because we can't work on every goal at all at the same time. And so for her, this was a way to capture her thoughts to either advocate at the meeting, but it also serves as a record in case when we do start working on some of those goals and outcome, we have some background information around the vision from a family perspective. So that's how we use those life domains and kind of ask you specific questions. The other principle is around the three buckets of support. So we call them buckets of support very intentionally because we say that you need all three things filled during the planning process. You should never focus on one of these things. When we do most of our sort of research and we're talking to individuals with disabilities and families, yes, services is absolutely what they need, but what they'll also tell you is I'm totally confused. I don't have enough information, or I have too much information and I don't know how to navigate it. That's the first one. How are we providing anyone we are planning with the information and education they need to understand the possibilities to make informed decisions, but also to implement things in their own life? The second one that we always hear from people is I feel alone. So how are we connecting people with disabilities and their families to others? How are we ensuring their emotional support? I always tell people, yeah, that's really great. You have a really great service plan. And yeah, you gave them information, but they're too depressed to get out of bed to implement it. So if we're not looking at the social emotional side in the planning process, one, to ensure that it's strong during the process, but two, in their life. Are they connected? Do they have emotional support? Do they have social capital? Do they have the peer support that they need? And so we're constantly using those three buckets throughout that planning process to really challenges ourselves as the facilitator of, am I addressing every bucket? They're all necessary. They're all important. One is not more important than the other. How do I fill all three buckets in every interaction I have, whether it's a planning interaction, a check-in interaction, or day-to-day service interaction? The integrated star, this is what I wanted to get to because I know we have about 20 minutes left. So where did this integrated star come from? It came from because, for years I kept hearing as a family member, I kept hearing policymakers say this. They would say formal services or natural supports. And I kept saying, well, what does natural supports mean? Like, what's an unnatural support? Because they're all supports and they're all natural. What's unnatural? And so people were like, people couldn't really define it. So we started in Missouri, and then we started across the country with our community of practice to say, what does natural supports mean? How do we operationalize natural supports? And what people started to say is, well, to me, natural supports is actually talking about people. It might be the unpaid staff in your, or unpaid people in your life, your family, your coach, your neighbor, your employer. For other people, natural supports were actually all of the things available in your community that anybody could access. You didn't necessarily need to be eligible or have a diagnosis to access those, and they weren't disability specific. And so we started to say, what if we stopped actually using the phrase natural supports? Because what I often find is natural supports creates a lot of sort of emotion. We when we were talking to people about operationalizing the word natural supports, they were like, "Yeah, so they asked me about my natural supports, and I tell them about them, and now all of a sudden I'm not eligible for services because they say, oh, you have all these supports, you don't need services." Or if the other thing is someone says, "Oh, great, you're eligible for services. So now let's actually like start creating your service plan. How do we leverage your natural supports?" And then oftentimes people will say, "Well, I'm here asking for help because I've leveraged my natural supports. I've exhausted my natural supports." And so I think we need to be very cognizant of the phrase natural supports. One, there's no clear definition. And two, how do you operationalize it? So we started to use phrases to say, well, we've got to figure out what it really means because we know there's more than just paid services as a solution to creating a good life. We know that we have to look and access other forms of supports. And so the integrated support star actually is a worksheet where we go around all 5 points of the star. We start with what is the person bringing to the table? What are the skills that's going to help them? What's the goal that they want? We write that goal right in the middle where that star is, and we say what do we need to enhance or build on with that individual? Relationship, who's in their life that can help support it or understands it or can sustain it or be a part of the support solution? What eligibility specific support? So really what government supports? Are there disability specific? Are there special ed, voc rehab? So maybe government's supports that will help solve that. What are the things in the community we can access? And what about technology? Technology is elevated at the same level the other one is because oftentimes in our planning process, technology is an add-on. Oh, also adaptive equipment or whatever. It actually should be equivalent to all of this. We're using technology now. You probably have had a cell phone for a long time, and it's helped you kind of solve a lot of different things. So how do we get people to realize when someone says, I have a need, we actually have 5 solutions to help that need? But what I tell people is that if you put all of your eggs in one of those solutions, the likelihood of you going towards what you don't want is high. We know people in 24-hour services with only paid support wrapped around their lives. We know their quality of life and their safety are sometimes jeopardized. So that challenges us for those that are getting 24-hour services to say to ourselves, how do we use more technology? How do we connect them to relationships? How do we get them in the community? Because right now they are completely dominated by eligibility-based supports. But the other could be said if our star is fully colored with purple, a family who has no supports for their son with significant behavioral support needs, who's now an adult, is only reliant on their relationships and that family caregiver. The likelihood of crisis and poor outcomes there is just as high as someone that's wrapped around 24-hour services and supports. So utilizing any one part of that star could take you in the direction you don't want to go. So our solution is the more we can leverage every part of that star in our problem solving and planning process, the more integrated our strategies are for supporting that person to really have an integrated and inclusive life. This is just an example of my little brother. If you look over on the right-hand side, we were going into his planning process and we thought, okay, it's kind of got all his other life domains figured out, but relationships are key. We know those are key to being a healthy, happy human being. And we know how hard relationships are for people that have a label of disability. So for us, we knew we wanted to go into that planning meeting and focusing on how are we as a support team going to strategize around supporting Eric in building and maintaining relationships. So we filled this star out so we could use it as a starting point. Eric's happy and funny. He loves police cars and tow trucks. He sees his girlfriend sometimes. He connects with his family a lot. He goes into the community, has scouts and Red Robin and racetracks. He has services from a companion. He uses an iPad and a smartphone. So we said we want to start with these things, but we want to build on them. And what is each one of our responsibilities for leveraging these and doing those? So we use the star to actually help us strategize with the services and get everybody on the team the same way. This star, though, was used when we were we run a family to family information and referral center. Transportation is a huge need. And so they said, how are we going to problem solve transportation? These people the person I'm talking to is not eligible. They do not, can't get any of the eligibility-based supports down there. So I still need to give them some answers because they still have to solve the transportation issue. So we started to say, well, can they ride a bike? Are they going to learn how to ride a bus? Can they learn how to drive? If all of those are no's, then we need to, continue to go around the star. Are there people who can help drive? Can you create a ride share program? Can we use Uber and use technology? What exists in our community? If they do have services, how are we using paid services to actually leverage the parts of the star? Can it pay for an iPad that we can put the Uber app on? Can we put an app on there to teach them how to take the bus line? And so we utilize every part of that star when we're thinking of innovative strategies to solve that. Another way that we've used the star is we use it for problem solving. It was really important to Ben's family that he doesn't have a guardian, but rather uses supported decision-making resources. But what did that really mean to them? You can't tell, but on the right-hand side is actually a resource document where we start defining different ideas around that domain. And what we did with Ben's family is we took each part of the star and we said, well, what do you have now? And what do you need to work on? Because supported decision making isn't just a piece of paper in the judge's chamber that says guardian or no guardian, but rather it's all of these things. Have we taught Ben how to stay safe? And what does that need to look like? Have we taught Ben how to use technology for making decisions? Have we identified the people in his life who would support him in making decisions? I mean, we set those things up legally. Are we accessing the automatic bill pay and the things that exist in our community? And there's a lot of things on there. So we started working with Ben's family years ago so that we can start adding on those and sort of crossing some things off and not having to do everything all at one time. The other way that we use the star is this is a real planning star for somebody. And so, the service coordinator went in with Candace and they planned they planned around what the person had and what they needed in each area of the star. And then you see, 6 months later, they got the star out again and they could see the different change. And so they're kind of using it to see goal attainment and sort of that evolution and document. I don't have time to totally dig into this one, but this is a really crucial one. We can use the star to actually start planning what a typical week looks like. When we first started working with Ben, this is what his life looked like. The purple was dependent on mom and dad. The green was dependent on paid staff. If either of those fell apart, he was going to be without services. So we needed to start building more options inside his star. And then we needed to start actually building the capacity that people were confident and comfortable with those things. His typical week did not start out like this. We had to build a little color here and there. And so what you start seeing is the dark purple are new friends and family that take him places. It's not just mom. You start seeing in the light blue him learning how to be at home utilizing technology. You see that they started using paid services very different because he self-directs his waiver. So you can use the STAR to actually really figure out how to leverage the services and supports you have available. I'm not going to go into this, but we can use this for staying positive with COVID. This is from someone else from around the country that used it for their team of service coordinators and said, how are we going to think about staying positive? What personal strengths do we have as a team? Who can we count on outside in our relationships? What side of supports inside our employment do we have? And they've kind of worked their way around the STAR. So the STAR is a limited list as a problem solving STAR. So I'm going to skip through these just to show you some of those examples. So I'm going to conclude with our last principle. And our last principle is no matter what you do, whether you're professionally just learning how to do person-centered planning, whether you're trying to decide how your program is going to implement person-centered planning, or if you're a policymaker making organizational or national policy decisions, all of those have to be driven by the individual who's receiving whatever program you're enhancing. So how are you ensuring that the person with the disability and their families are making decisions that drive what your practices and what your policies are? But more importantly, how are we doing that across the lifespan, not just in the disability or the social service arena, but we've got to start really helping people have this framework and this level of thinking inside and outside of our service system. So with that, Mark, I'm going to pass it over to you.